By the way that he would look at you, you would know that this man was evil. It wasn't so much the way that he walked or talked, it was a look inside of his eye. And his fingers were quicker than a wink or a blink of an eye. He could stretch and reach for anything, and the thing that he loved more than anything else was gold. With his thick fingers, he would pull his long blonde hair away from his eyes so that he could see them all the better. And he was strong, very strong, and that was a good thing, because here he was on the rough sea in a longship that was made of polished wood, that had seen many journeys and had known many stories. But he was rowing alone. He was going back to collect those things that he had stolen from his enemies. And he had placed them by the side of the shore, far away from his own village. And he'd placed them there because he knew that no one else would go there. For there were lies and rumours and stories and sagas that spoke about those people. Not humans, not gods, but neither man nor beast nor God, who lived in these bays and these inlets, and it was that he used to hide his gold, his loot. He wasn't frightened of anything. The old religion was going anyway, so what difference did it make, the way that they spoke of the gods? He wanted to bathe in the gold. He would like to have arms wrapped about him, and he would be able to cascade gold from the top of his head and all over his clothes and feel gold upon his skin. But now it was windy. There was a biting rain that was cutting against his beard and making him close his eyes. Many were scared to come to this place even when the sun shone, but not him. There was a screaming noise. At first he thought it was perhaps just the wind through trees or through his sail. It could have been a voice, but he wasn't sure. It might have been a scream, but there was a glee, a happiness in the voice. And he could see his flag as it flapped in the breeze, and that was the signal that told him that this was the right place to come and collect his gold. He reached down. He pulled the longship up onto the pebbly beach, and he didn't even wait to make sure that the longship would stay in its place, for he almost fell into the water and pulled out the bag of gold, pushed his hand inside, and the first thing that his fingers touched was a golden flute. He might have been strong, his voice might have been the most powerful, and his arm that would be raised first in any battle, but he could play this flute. It was a sweet sound. He couldn't stop himself. Without even counting the gold, he picked up the flute and started to play it. Sweet notes rose up above all of the scream of the wind and the rain, filled the air. And as he played, he forgot himself. And it was then, when he turned back towards the shore, that he saw that there was, upon the beach, a tent, a golden tent, made of old cloth, and beside it there was a house, almost like a longhouse. The longhouse was made out of rough wood, but the tent was made out of gold, and it was gold that he loved more than anything else. And he had a terrible curiosity, a curiosity that would be his undoing. You would think that he would have gone into the house, but he didn't. It was the tent with all of its finery, its golden thread and stitching, that made him go inside. He only had to stoop his head a small amount, for it was tall, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness and the noise of the tent as it flapped in the breeze and the wind, it was there that he saw that there was a figure, a male figure, a small statue, no longer than his forearm. And he looked at it. But it was made out of gold. And this was what he loved more than anything. "Well, my little man," he spoke. "Well, my little man, then you shall be mine. Its skin, where it had been cut and carved and moulded, it was smooth. But as he picked it up, he placed it at his neck. He had wanted to bathe in gold, but this small man's statue, it was as if the arms could move, for they wrapped their arms about him, and the skin, once so smooth, the golden skin, was now scaled and sharp, and the arms wrapped themselves not once, not twice, not 3 times, and now he was stood there in this place, this powerful man, tall and strong, but wrapped in the bonds of gold, the gold that he had wanted so much. And it was, as he looked towards the face of the small figure, this elf from the underworld, that he could see its sharp teeth. In the reign of Henry, everyone else was poor in this place, but this girl was rich, well-fed, tall, and she could have kept that money to herself, but she thought that she would give whatever money she could to the poor. But if she was to walk up to them, they were proud people who would refuse any money and see it as a charity. So she would give the money secretly. She would place it upon their doorsteps, she would leave it upon their window sills, a coin here, or perhaps a piece of food. But now, living in this place by the side of the fast-flowing river, by the edge of the rocky sea, she thought that she would go and swim. Now, it was very unusual for anyone to go and swim, but she knew that if she did nothing, which would be very easy for her to do, if she did nothing, then her limbs would wither, and she knew that she would need to have a blood course throughout the whole of her body. And one of the things that she loved the most was to fight against the sea, to swim, and it would make her feel alive, and the same as everyone else, for no one could see by her fine clothes whether she was rich or not. She loved the feel of the soft sea. It was freezing cold upon her skin. And she also loved to read inside of a diary. She would write each and every day when she had been down by the side of the rough rocky sea, where she had swum, what she had seen, what she had done. She loved this. But now it was a dark midday in the middle of winter, and the sea seemed to be even colder. As the waves slopped and slurped all about her, she wondered what it was she could have been doing. She could have been in her bed. She could have had her head upon a pillow. She could have done nothing more or nothing less that day than feed her dog. And when she thought about it, the dog ate better food than many of the people who lived inside of the village. But it was as she was swimming, she looked. She pulled the ball of string that she had tied to a belt, which made sure that she would know which side of the sea to go back to, where she could get herself dried and go back to her rich and fine clothes. But it was as she pulled upon the string, perhaps it was just the way that the sea turned her head, she looked and she could see that there was a merchant ship. But as she looked and she rubbed at her eyes, it was then that she saw that one of the portholes was not a porthole, but it was a cannon trap. Now, it wasn't unusual for the word pirate to be mentioned, but why such a merchant ship, so close to a friendly port, would have so many cannons, she could only guess. And it was then, before that cannon trap closed down, she looked and she could see, stack upon stack, of cannonball. She knew that this must be a pirate ship. But what could she do to warn the people in the town that this pirate ship was coming here upon this midwinter's day to come and destroy all of the shipping by the sea? She was no fool. She pulled at the string until it snapped, and all she had was a length, probably about 15 paces long. But she swam towards the ship. She tied it to the anchor chain, and she also swam further out to sea. Further out to sea, to where there was a buoy that had in it a bell that would ring, and she pulled on the string and tied it to the bell, and the bell would not stop ringing. And of course it was this that caused all of the fishermen to look towards this pirate ship, and to see that it was not a friendly merchant ship. A shot rang out towards the sea and from the pirate ship. The only thing that was found of that girl was when people looked, and on her bedside, by a pillow, there was a diary. And on the previous evening she had written down in her diary, "Tomorrow upon midwinter's day, I shall wish to do something really good." And she had. She had saved that town by the side of the rough rocky sea, by the fast flowing river, saved them from a pirate attack. And that was the best thing that she could have done. Her eyes were clear and blue, her hair was long and straight, and there was a small smile upon her lips, but she was a rich lady. There was no way that you could doubt this, because she had a long-sleeved blue top to her dress. It was made of shining silk, and now, outside of this huge palace, the huge palace that was made of small stones, perhaps it was the very fact that the stones were so small and there were so many of them that made the palace even greater. Her arms were as thin as sticks, and she had just come away from giving her friends pink glittering pearls and amusing those people at court with her dancing. Oh, she was a good dancer. But even with her thin arms, I've got to tell you that she was the strongest person in her family. She had inherited her father's thick hands, but now she's going to go and see her sister. Outside of the palace, when she looked inside, she could see the throne that was made of every colour of the rainbow, with pointed wood at its top and studded with fine gems of gold. Once inside, she could look out. She could see through the wooden frames and the pinned and paned glass, and it made her smile to think that here there were tapestries, pictures made of wool and golden thread of her sister, her older sister. These two girls who had played together so long, but in her hand she had a map of all of the world, at least as much of the world as was known in those times. She was thinking of a way that she could get her sister to come away from the palace. Oh yes, she had married the king, for these were troubled times, and a whisper of a religion could cause a head to be parted from its shoulders. She was thinking about how she'd love to be with her sister who was now the Queen, her older sister. How they would sit together this night and drink from clear, clean, reflective glasses. They would drink sweet red wine that would leave a taste of strawberries upon the tongue. She was wondering, as she went across the ground in her high wooden clogs on the diamond-shaped blue tiles of the floor, she was going to go and see her sister. She had to go past portraits of all of the best of kings, at least for those who considered the best of kings, for the way that they thought and the way that they prayed. Charlotte was going to see her sister, Rebecca. Rebecca would wear her queen's robes upon her back, a crown upon her head, but she was not happy. She was not happy as the Queen. It had been a marriage between two warring countries, and she was not happy, and there were whispers and rumours that said that the king was tired of her, and he would do anything that he could to get rid of her. She met her sister. They smiled. They looked at the candle in front of them, with each of the marks at its side, for between each mark 60 minutes would pass. And it was by the flickering flame that the two of them sat and laughed and talked about old times, times before these times, and the wine was sweet upon their lips. But it was then that they could see the king, and they could not tell whether it was a knife in his hand or a crucifix. And as they looked, they could see time passing by the flickering and guttering light of the flame of the candle. Charlotte had something for her sister. When the king came in, he came and spoke. He was broad and wide and even older than her sister. They were frightened of him. They were both frightened of him. But Charlotte had something. It was a small vial of poison. A poison that was going to be placed inside of a glass. But it wasn't going to be while she was there, but the king. He knew that there were plots and rumours. And he watched as a glass of wine was preferred to him. No. Sister of the Queen, my dear sister-in-law, please, you should have the freshest of glasses. Rebecca looked. She knew that her sister had put the poison inside of the glass, and if she would refuse, then both of them would be killed for plotting to kill the king. Charlotte raised the glass to her lips. She looked to her sister, knowing that this would be the last time that her eyes would see her upon this earth. The glass fell to the ground. Many years later, Rebecca would return from her own country, and she would stand in the middle of a forest, and she would look, and there she would see the yellow coffin, the yellow wooden coffin that her sister Charlotte had been placed in, far from others' eyes, that only she would know. And as the years had passed, the grass had started to grow over the top of it, but she couldn't wait in this place, for the ground was wet and muddy, to make sure no animals would come to this place. A tear was at the side of her eye, that her sister had sacrificed herself by that candle light's flame, so that she could escape and live for another day. Even to look at her would let you know that she was mean and she was nasty. Her hair was long and brown and plaited and ran over her shoulders, and held in place with rough, shining, thick string. But these eyes, these blue eyes, these clear blue eyes, only let you know the more that there was something wicked inside of her head and her heart. Everyone else inside of the village would not like to have her close, and so it meant that she would climb the tall trees, she would stay in the dark woods and spy on people. She wasn't the strongest of girls. She had a long, short-sleeved, ragged cloth dress, held in place with an old, long leather belt. But she would cook and grow vegetables away from the village. And she loved to cook them until they were as sweet as honey. She was no fool of a girl. She wasn't strong. Her arms were thin and pale, and her fingers were scratched from digging in the dirt. But it was really the way that she would watch others and take things and be separate from everyone else, almost as if she thought that she was better than everyone else. But it was there, as she would look after the animals, for the wild animals liked her. Everything that could creep and crawl, everything that grew and flew, everything upon no legs, 2 legs that slipped and slimed and crept and crawled and slipped and slithered. Oh, she could summon them by her own voice. But as she was there, she could see something or someone in amongst all of the trees, for they swayed in a cold, dark breeze. They swayed and they moved. Oh, she'd been afar away from the villagers, and she'd heard the stories about the Norsemen, those who had come from the north, who would come to this place. Stories had abounded about them, that they had their own religion, that they believed in the way that animals would creep and crawl and walk and grew and flew. She quite liked the idea of them. But now in the darkness, amongst all of the trees, she could see these men with armour at their shoulders and swords in their belts, creeping this way and that in amongst all of the trees. She knew that the smell of the vegetables that she was cooking would warn them that this was a place where there were people, and where there was people, there would be livestock, and there would be gold, and there would be people to kill. The tall trees were now bending in the strong cold wind and the shadows in the darkness, and her being far away from the others, she knew that there was not enough time. If she had had time, perhaps she could have scribed a message, for she was a girl and she could cut into rocks signs, but there was no way that she could get to the others. She smiled to herself. She knew what she would have to do. She took the thick string that tied her hair in its plaits, and it was long and it was strong, and she knew that if she could tie it between 2 trees, then as these men crept and rushed towards the village, then perhaps in their haste they would trip over one another and fall, and the noise that they would make would warn the others. And that was exactly what she did. Now her hair blew in the cold, strong breeze. And yes, sure enough, these men who had travelled many days across the sea to come to this place did trip and fall, and it was then that she summoned all of the animals. Those things with no legs, those things with 2, those things with 6 and 8, that had hard-shelled bodies, ants, frogs, horses, sheep. And she summoned them all to charge towards the men as they lay with their limbs this way and that piled upon each other, intent on killing everyone inside of the village. But with their ways and their belief in all of the beasts of the field, they believed that if the animals would not accept them in this land, then they should return to their home, and that is just what they did. Everyone inside of the village heard the great commotion that these Norsemen had made. When they saw the snapped, thick string that they recognised as that had held her hair in place, they knew that they should celebrate her rather than fear her for her spying. for many knew that she would pick fights with them, even though her arms were not strong. And as she sat down at the head of the table in the great longhouse, she watched everyone with their wild and vigorous dancing, and she was given by the chief of the village a small leather strap that she could use to tie her hair in place. And she sat there as if she was the queen of all of these people. She felt warm, calm, relieved that she had saved all of these people who might one day become her friends. She was surprised. She wished that it had always been like this. Surrounded by bones, bodies and blood, he knew that he had not won in this battle. All he could see was the chieftain of his warrior clan. He was a boy who was much older than his years, mature, strong in his arms and his heart. But he would never admit to this. But when he thought about his brother and his father, who had died in battle before him, then a tear, a small, salty, silvery tear, would run its way down the side of his cheek. At the top of his head, he had a sharp golden helmet. It pushed down his chunky blonde hair. He had a round face, just like his father's. He had a dimpled chin, just like his father and his brother. But as he looked about with his pale brown eyes, he knew that this was a battlefield where he had lost. It was a great dishonour to leave the battlefield still alive, but there was nothing else that he could do. All of his enemies had gone. They'd left the field as it was, and here they were on the soft silky sand where the sea ran red with the blood. There were scattered swords and shields all about this place, and in the distance all he could see were the slippery, snowy mountains. His red flowing cloak, he pulled it about himself, and he couldn't fight the air, and he was wounded himself, and the only thing that he could think of doing was to go away from there, and perhaps live to fight and die another day. This was a boy who dreamt of chasing dragons, who saw Thor, the good and great god Thor, as someone that he would try to be like. He was older than his years, but he was sensible. At least if he could recover, then he could fight another day. And all he had to stop the blood was a smooth, soft cloth that had been drenched at one other time with his father's own blood. And he thought that if he were to clamp it to the wound, then he would get some of his father's strength inside of his own blood. His heavy wooden shield had not helped him. His small scratched sword was no use now when there was no one left to fight. Everyone thought of him as a hero. They regarded him like he was a hero. But would they have thought of him as a hero as someone who had walked away from a battlefield and left it behind? But the wound was really hurting. He could not think of what to do. He tried to hold back the tears when he wondered what his father would have said to him. But as he reached inside of his cloak, he found some medicine, a salve of herbs that his brother had made for him when his brother had still been alive. He went up the mountain, up the slippery, snowy slopes, and found himself in a cave. He was fearful, worried that he should die before he had a chance to fight. But there was only one of him and many of these other clansmen who had come to this place. You knew that they were there because they brought their short wooden longboats, so different from his own clan. But on this icy mountain, there was a cold chill that went through his skin and right to his bones and his heart. Look, he would go and steal and pillage from the heathen Christians so that he could give to the poor in his own village. He found a cave. It was wet. He was cold. And he was worried that he would die before he had a chance to avenge his father, his brother, his clan chief, and all of the people inside of his village. He didn't know what he could do. But he had a candle that he could light by striking a stone against the side of his sword, which would cause a spark. The spark would become a flame, and the flame would... And it was then that it occurred to him. Oh, this enemy clan that had come to this place were now relishing in their victory. So they were not looking after their short wooden longboats. When he was better, when he was well, the very next morning, he looked about. There they were, lying there, drunk by the side of the dying fires. He rested upon his heavy wooden shield, and it held his weight. And even though the wound stung as the salt water went inside of it, he could smell victory in his own nostrils. He sculled his way towards their boats. He'd made sure that he'd kept some tinder, some small pieces of moss and fern, wrapped up and inside and dry. With no one to look after their longships, he got on board quite easily. The stone and his sword, he struck them together. The spark went into the tinder, he blew upon it. The smoke became a flame, and the flame, it leapt into the wood of the longships. To the next one, to the next one. Oh, he did his job well. He might not have died upon the field of battle, but he had lived to fight another day. These strangers would be left there far away from their own homes, left there with no ships to take them home, left there with nothing and no one to support him. He would find another clan. He would teach them his own skills, for he was older than his years and he had learned a lesson. Sometimes when he would sit by the side of the fire, he would see his father and his brother, and they would talk to him. Stay strong. Stay strong. Be brave. Be as brave as Thor and never give up. And he was so pleased that he hadn't given up. There were some things that he could not resist, and one of the things that he loved more than anything else was to eat brown seeded bread and place upon that bread fine, fat, suckling pig. He loved the taste upon his lips, teeth and tongue. But as it was, his skin was filthy brown and patched. His curly fair hair was long, untidy and filthy, but it didn't stop him smiling, not just with his lips, but his dark sky blue eyes. It was a village winter. There was a cold freezing wind that flowed down from the frosty mountains. It blew through the bare-leaved trees, and some of the houses They had rough Welsh slate upon the roof, but most were thick thatched. His beard was no better than his hair. It was thick and it was curly and hung down onto his chin. He had no wish to wash, for that was the sort of thing that some people did inside of the city, and he was pleased to live inside of this village. He had lived there all of his life, except when he had been in battle, for he was an archer. You could tell by his broad shoulders, his worn fingers upon his hands, strong in his arms, and so used to pulling a bow and an arrow and letting fly in the heart of a battle. Nothing really let you know that he'd been a soldier, nothing other than the fact that there was a wound, an arrow wound in his left leg that left him sometimes with a limp and sometimes so that he hobbled. His tunic was pale blue velvet. His fingers were still strong. But inside of the village there was a thief. And it was him. No one else knew that it was him. For even as a child, as a boy, as a young man, he had always stolen. But now he was confused about the way that he always stole things, and it wasn't as if he spent money wildly. Many of the things he kept, and he could not explain to anyone why. He had kept them inside of his house, and his house was a poor house, but he had kept them all, and now he knew that there were things that needed to change. He was confused and guilty about all of the thievery that he had done. Inside of his pantaloons that were made out of soft leather, he had a purse which had stolen things inside of it. And it was there, as he looked amongst all of the wooden framed houses. It was a small village, but busy. There was a huge shire horse that was pulling a black tar painted carriage, richer than any that he'd seen inside of this village. It had obviously come from the city, and whoever was inside must have been rich, for the carriage bore a coat of arms of 3 dogs, teeth bared, tails straight, paws ready to pounce. He didn't know who it was, and he might have been confused. He might have felt guilty. But it didn't stop his old ways returning, for his fingers itched to see what it was that he could steal, and he thought that he could steal something from inside of this carriage. Upon his soft leather boots that made no sound upon the ground, he came closer. In his other hand, he was eating at a ripe golden apple, for here at the turn of the year, to have a fresh apple was a good thing. You could tell by smell alone that there was a beautiful lady inside of the carriage, but it wasn't the smell of her pomade, it wasn't the smell of her potpourri, it wasn't the smell of her freshly laundered clothes. It was the smell of city bread. Oh, he'd got used to drinking good strong ale, but he never mistook the smell of city bread. It was white, it was fine, as was the custom that had come over from France. It was fine and it was white, and he wanted some. For a moment he forgot to take any money. It was only when he saw 2 loaves of bread that he decided that he would take them both. These were troubled times in Tudor times, for thievery was not regarded well. Thievery bore many penalties. For the stealing of a loaf, it could mean a hanging. For the stealing of a sheep, it would mean transportation and far away from that place. But the temptation of a fine white crusted loaf was too much for him, and he didn't even take the time to hide himself. He broke the bread. He'd stuffed it inside of his tunic. He broke the bread. The crumbs were all there inside of his thick, greasy chin of a beard. And it was then that he felt a strong hand upon his shoulder, and he was dragged in front of the carriage. "Well, my dear man, I see that you have a tasting for fine things. And in this country of ours, the king looks upon it in a very poor light when someone will take a fair lady's bread. For that you could be hung. But I can see that you have served the king well when you have fought in his army, for your shoulders are broad and your fingers are worn. Then perhaps I shall remove your hand or your 2 fingers that helped you to pull the bowstring." He'd felt guilty for long enough. He knew that perhaps this would be a punishment that would teach him a lesson. He stretched out his hand in front of this lady. She raised a sword high in the air, and he did not flinch, for he was ready to take the punishment that she was going to give to him. She raised that sword high in the air, brought it down towards his hand, and at the last moment, all he could feel was the breeze of the sword as it passed by his hand. "Perhaps," and she was feeling very playful, "perhaps you should get yourself to the city, and if by the time the moon has passed across the sky 2 times, and you have brought me back 2 loaves, then I shall let you live as you have always lived, with all of your fingers and thumbs upon your hand. Now go." He didn't really know how far it would be to get to the city, or whether he could make it there and back with a loaf in 2 days. But he went. He ran as fast as his legs could, and sometimes the wound in his leg would throb and ache. But he found himself. At the end of the day, he didn't need to ask anyone how to find the baker's shop. For inside of the baker's shop, which was the only place that would have ovens, he could smell all of the beautiful food that was being cooked in the ovens after the bread had been baked. There was a meaty aroma in the air. This shop was small but wide. He felt warmth on his skin as he came inside. It was cosy and welcoming, kind and friendly, and cleaner than he had ever seen anything, including his own skin, in all of his life. "Well, what brings you here?" said the old baker, and he told of his story, of how he would save his fingers upon his hand if he could return and bring the bread. It was the end of the day. The baker would have to try and make some dough and cook it before the time would come for him to return. This archer, this rich man, this thief, watched as the baker baked the bread, and it was as he watched he realised that if he were to try and return things without anyone finding out that he was a thief, then he could place it inside of the bread. Oh, he did return, and he did give that fine lady her 2 loaves of French city bread. But from that time he cooked himself, and he would bake bread, and in each loaf he would place a coin or a ring or a necklace or a bracelet or anything that he could that had been stolen, and lay the bread upon the windowsill, the window ledge, the mantelpiece, or at the doorway of those people that he had taken those things from, so that they would never know that it was him who had been the thief. And people would say that the bread that they found by their door or their window ledge was all the sweeter for finding lost and stolen things inside of it. The only light inside of this hut by the side of the battlefield was from tallow candles held in tall wooden candlesticks. But this boy pulled his small bony fingers through his short, dirty, straight hair. For 2 years he had travelled with the Sawbones to go to each of the battlefields. The Sawbones, it was in his name. This was a man, a Sawbones, a doctor, a quack, who, if there hadn't been so many battles for the king, would have been hung for wizardry and witchcraft. But he was a neighbour to his father, and he had taken the boy under his wing and taken him to many foreign fields to fight. And now, in the darkness of the hut, the boy would do his work. For the Sawbones did as his name described. He would saw at bones, not to make men better, but just to make sure that they lived from their injuries. For many men on the battlefield would not be killed by a pike or a sword or an arrow, but by the fever and the infection that would come with each of their wounds. The boy had learnt many things with his father and with the Sawbones doctor, and now he would take a silver needle and he would try and make each of the wounds better. He would stitch and sew at the bones and skin and sinew of those who had been treated to the Sawbones work. Outside of the door of the hut there was a pile of useless weapons, because they could no longer use them without an arm or a leg. But he always felt their pain. Sometimes he would have to hold the soldiers down, but his job was to watch and to learn, and he had learned well. Often he would have joy in his heart, for those soldiers who had been treated inside of the hut would say that he was almost like an angel for the way that he had helped them. He was helpful with medicines and salves, not just with the work that he could do with his fingers. Even in this place, he could sometimes bring himself to smile, but there would always be between his bare toes mud and blood. For all of his work, he was given 1/2 penny a week, plus 3 turnips upon which to feast. But before he'd been taken away, he'd always dreamt that he could sing and juggle for a living, but there was nothing to sing or to juggle about here in this foreign field. He would often cover his nose and his mouth to try and keep the stench away from the back of his throat. But it was as he looked and he watched the Sawbones with his silver saw sawing backwards and forwards that another wounded soldier was brought inside of the hut. But the crest upon his armour showed that he was a king. As the Sawbones raised his silver saw, the king yelled, "No! You must not remove my right arm, for my right arm holds the ring that makes me a sovereign and king of this place." The Sawbones looked down. "Well, your majesty, be you king or commoner, there is nothing that I can do to stop the fever that would creep and crawl inside of your blood." The boy saw this as his chance. "Your majesty, I may well be a boy, but I've learnt many things from my father." He didn't bother to tell the king at this moment in time that the things that he had learned had been in how to minister to horses and cattle. "But, your majesty, if you could trust me, then I will try my best to save your arm." The king saw this as his only chance. "Well then, boy, I shall trust you, and you must save my arm." Sometimes the door would creak open on this wooden hut. It had been rain-soaked in the past, and the wood was soft. There was a smell of eggs and mouldy food and a stench of death in the air. But the boy told the king that he must chew upon rotten apples, for the boy was going to make a poultice to place into the wound. The boy himself took some of the rotten wood and broke it up and placed it in a poultice and placed it upon the king's arm and wrapped it in a bandage and cleaned it. It was only as the door would perhaps creak open that the stinging sunlight would come in and the full horror of what was going on inside of the hut could be seen. But the boy only cared to look after the king. The only light that came into that place was from waxy tallow candles that were made from pig and sheep fat. But the king did fall into a fever. But the boy ministered to him. He cleaned the wounds that the king had. After about 5 days, the king's fever subsided. After a week, the king was well enough to stand. And after a fortnight, when the battle had been won without the king upon the battlefield, the king looked at the boy. The king flexed his arm. "You have done well for me, boy. You may be young, but you have the wisdom of many a grown man. You must come with me." The boy wondered what it was that the king was going to do for him, for a king can do many things. The king took him to a town that was almost full to bursting. The boy could see some of the soldiers that had been ministered to by the sawbones, but it was a dusty and a dirty town. The wood was dull, but as soon as he walked into that place, he had a wish to bathe. There was a thirst upon his tongue that could only have been quenched by sweet wine or maybe frothy beer. But the king took the boy to the king's cousin's house. It was so far removed from the battlefield. It was pretty. It was beautiful to see. There was crystal. There were ornaments all around. And as they went in through the oval sweep of a royal gate that was held with a crest at its top and made out of aged silvered oak, the great metal hinges squeaked and creaked as the boy went in to a huge hall. It was filled with soldiers from the fields. Counts, lords, dukes, earls. But the king was there, and he made the boy kneel in front of him. The king raised a great sword high in the air. The boy thought that for all of his work, all of his helping, that he was going to have his head removed from his shoulders, and the king took the sword and tapped him once upon one shoulder and once upon the other shoulder and told him, "Arise, for now you shall be from now on and for all time a sawbones, quack and doctor to the king." As the boy became a man, the king would ask him to tell the tale of how he had saved the king's right arm, and also ask him to tell the assembled company that how he had learnt his trade by tending not to humans or soldiers, but to cows and to sheep and to pigs. This life had taught her many desperate lessons, and now, in this forest by the side of a cold shallow river, she was praying to the god Loki, the god of mischief and misdeeds. She prayed loud and long. Her voice was sweet, but the words that she spoke were terrible to hear. "In battle, I wish that I shall never die, O my Lord Loki." The wind blew through her long blonde hair. Her eyes, she rubbed at them. You could tell that she was a woman by the length of her hair. But she had a battle axe at her back, and a long grey sword at her side. Her body was covered with a short-sleeved, long but ragged shift dress. It was the way that the shift dress was held in place that would take your breath away. For it was a belt of trophies, the tips of swords for all of those men that she had killed. She would take the sword tips after she could see that the enemy had been killed. She would break their swords and keep the sword tip and take them to a blacksmith, and he would place them one inside of another, and it reminded her of just what kind of a warrior she was. She loved to fight. She took pleasure in hurting. In any spare moments that she had, she would sit in the woods and sharpen weapons. But now she had prayed to Loki, the god of mischief and misdeeds. She knew that she was being watched by him. She loved to show off her prowess. She loved to show off that she was stronger than the men, and she made sure that she always won. Listen, she hadn't always been like this. Once she was kind and soft and gentle. But when her younger brother was killed as a child, it had turned her from all sense of kindness. She knew what it was to fight, and now she'd wished that in battle she would never die. A cold wind passed through the tall trees, and it was as she looked down she could see something on the ground. Oh, Lord Loki, he looked after her, and he had left at her feet a golden charm bracelet. The rustling sound between the trees sounded like his voice, and the way that he spoke to her was this: "The choice is yours. If you wish to never die, then take this." He appeared in front of her in the form of a man, and he sculled his hand into that cold shallow river and proffered to her a drink of the water. "For if you take a drink from this, then you shall win and never die." The choice was hard. She could smell her own fear. She wondered if she could never die herself, that she might regret the killing that she might do and all of the killing that she had done. The only thing that let you know that she had once been kind and soft and gentle were the golden strapped sandals upon her feet, and on these feet she stepped forward and drank of the water. It was salty to the taste, but you could feel it. She could feel her back becoming straighter and stronger. And it was then that Lord Loki, the god of mischief and misrule, spoke to her. "Now, I must warn you, for if you listen, like the bells upon the charm bracelet that you have at your wrist, the bits inside of your enemies' horses' mouths are rattling. Now listen." And it was true. As she listened, she could hear the hooves pounding. She touched the charm bracelet, and it was as she touched it that she seemed to find courage. She called to the men, "Now is our time to fight or die." And she wondered what those words meant now that she knew she'd been blessed by Lord Loki himself. The battle went well. She touched another of the charms upon the bracelet, and another, and she called to Lord Loki to help her. "Are you sure that you wish for my help?" "Oh yes, Lord Loki." And it was then that Loki placed his 2 fingers inside of his mouth and whistled, loud and long and piercing, and from out of the ground he summoned underworld warriors. They were strong and fierce. Their skin glowed red and hot like glowing rock. And before these warriors, with her at their front, all of the enemies fell like waves that is pulled at the seashore. The men cheered her, but the underworld warriors needed to return to the volcanic island under the ground. The woman was standing there. For every wound, she didn't feel anything upon her skin, but then she became terrified because Loki had made sure that she would not die, and he had asked her if the choice was hers to use these warriors, and once she had them called, then she was horrified as she watched, because now the warriors were dragging her with them towards that volcanic island and to the underworld. Her skin was burnt and roasted, but she couldn't feel any pain. She was furious, for Loki was the god of misrule, misdeeds and mischief, and she had been tricked. She'd been tricked, and for the first time in her life she was frightened, for she was dragged under this world towards a place where all of the lava would boil and bubble, and these warriors were dragging her towards the lava and the white hot heat. And under the ground everything was white and hot and terrible. She felt it was lonely to have to suffer in this way, terrible to be in that place. And each day Loki would come and see her, for her skin burnt away from her bones, but she could not die, and with each renewal it turned to rock and was as hot as the lava that was under the ground. He would smile, he would laugh, as he would hear the charm bracelet rattle, as she would sink beneath the lava. And always she would feel lonely, to realise that she'd been given the choice, and now she was being left to suffer on her own.